My name's Stephen Ozanne. I'm joined on stage by Martyn Dorey, and together with Pete Francis, who's in the audience, we make up the Project Ozoris. There's the three of us. Now, imagine a world where you have complete equality for justice for all, where laws are not about prescriptive rules, but about outcomes and objectives that we wish to achieve, and where the machines and computers that increasingly surround us every day have to abide by the same rules as we do. Keep those 3 points in mind because we're going to come back onto them. So about 12 months ago, as Mark was saying, we got together as part of a project in Guernsey to look how we could reassess our approach to law. And most people think about law as being a very complex subject. It governs what we can and cannot do and sets horrendous consequences if we get it wrong. You go to jail. But it's fundamentally important in our society. It is the fabric of our society. It creates certainty and it governs our relationships with each other. And in fact, every day we're entering into billions of contracts without even giving it a conscious thought. It's for the complexity in law, which means it's actually relatively inaccessible for a lot of people. You need experienced, qualified people to be able to advise on it. And so a lot of people don't have the access unless they can afford a good lawyer. So as part of the project we started out looking at is what we called crowd law. It's part of the Dandelion project. And what we set out to do was see how we could get society to be more involved in the legislative process and actually being involved in creating or amending laws. And as part of that project, Martyn, Pete and I met, and we noticed we had a common interest in that we wanted to see how we could apply technology to solve the accessibility problem in relation to law. And we did some research at the time to see what technology was out there. There's a lot of technology in relation to helping lawyers do legal research, but there isn't really anything out there at the time that would enable people who weren't lawyers to get their own answers out of the law. So that didn't stop us. We decided to create our own technology. And as we started to think about what we'd actually create, we started to see how laws were drafted was actually not that dissimilar to how a computer program is coded. Particular words are used because they have particular meanings, they have particular outcomes and particular objectives. And as we started to think about that more and more, it dawned on us, why can't we just get a computer to read a law as if it was a computer program? Imagine what we could do with that. At the time, again, we did a bit of research and we couldn't find any bit of technology which already enabled that to happen. So we decided to create our own and see what we could come up with. There's a few difficulties you have with it. Computers are notoriously not very good at reading natural language, which is the languages used to draft laws, books, text, articles you read in newspapers. And in fact, the very famous computer scientist and codebreaker, Alan Turing, this is part of his thesis, is about a lot of it saying why computers are not good at reading natural language and the problems there. But that didn't stop us. You put a lawyer, an actuary, and a political scientist together, and you have some pretty extraordinary things happen. And we created our own solutions. We created our own programming language, which we've called Lex Plus. So, Martyn, what's the thinking behind Lex Plus?
Thank you, Pete. I generally like to start talking with a joke, just to lighten up. And the joke would probably be along the lines of an actuary, a lawyer, and a political scientist going to a bar. But I tried it out my wife, and she said, look, none of the jokes end with the lawyer at the bottom of the sea or the actuary being killed in frustration. So I thought I wouldn't start with a joke. So let's kick off. Guernsey has one of the oldest legal systems in the world. Our legal system goes back at least 900 years, and we brought it with us to the UK when we invaded in 1066. Go Normandy. Now, this is a section from the Magna Carta, 1215, King John, Runnymede Fields. This isn't intended to be a history lesson, but to make the point that this was essentially a contract between barons and the king. And this formed a lot of the template for constitutions in the US and elsewhere, but it all followed pretty much the same story. You've got a court, and if it's not the king sitting on the throne, it's a judge. And the framework pretty much hasn't changed since. So around the 1600s, there was a problem that started to emerge. In the 1600s, people invented this word, the law is an ass. And what they meant by it was that the law was unyielding, unmovable, and stubborn. And Charles Dickens went to write about this in Oliver Twist when Mr. Bumble says, and if the law thinks that, the law is an ass. And that was in the Victorian age, the 1600s. My old man used to come back home from work, and I was a little kid at the time, and he'd bang the kitchen table, and my mum would say, "What's the matter?" He said, "I've had a bad day." And she said, well, what could it possibly be? Well, I can't talk about it, but I'll say this, the law is an ass. Let me let you into a secret. My dad was a High Court judge. So how is it that a High Court judge, whose role is to interpret law for everyone, thinks the law is occasionally an ass? And it's because sometimes outcomes don't match our expectations. And I think if first generation law is about having prescriptive rules, and second generation law, which is what regulators around the world are working on at the moment, are principles, I think there's a third generation we can start to aim for now. And that is, law should be based around objectives and outcomes. And these could all be real-time and dynamic. So how do we get the lawyers to buy into new ideas? And the key thing is, I think the law can learn from what's happened in other professions. I was talking to Luke Whedon and Thomas Bader last night. Thomas Bader runs his own coffee roasting company. And they immediately said, look, when technology changes and technology comes into play, people go for bigger problems, bigger goals. Architects are now building skyscrapers a kilometre high. What are lawyers doing? A lot of them are still working with find and replace in documents. So I think, guys, come on, we need to move the game on. Which brings me to the next point. Now, I'm going to pick on someone. I tend to do this, I'm sorry. I want you to think carefully for a moment. I'm going to ask one of you a question. I'm going to give you a number. The number is 1, 2, 1. Think of that in your mind. Now, I want you to add 1 to each of those units. 1, 2, 1. The first one, add 1 to it. Right, look at me when you're doing it. Okay? What I'm seeing in all of you is when you go through the calculation, your pupils dilate just a little bit because you're doing what's called slow thinking. Daniel Kahneman said there's 2 types of thought. There's slow thinking and there's fast thinking. Slow thinking is very laboured, very hard work. But fast thinking is effortless, and it happens in our subconscious. So, 1, 2, 1, plus 1 to each of the units. What have I got?
2, 3, 2.
Brilliant, and your eyes dilated. Can we now go to the computer input screen? It's always a bit dodgy doing live demonstrations of software, so this is a bit of an experiment. This is a scene from Blade Runner, and the whole point, you could tell the difference between an android and a human because their eyes dilated when asked a set of embarrassing questions, what's called the blush response. We've decided, in fact we've worked out, that actually this is a very important part of getting machines to understand law. They have to work hard to understand, they have to labour over the difficult things, and then we're going to translate that into a subconscious part of the computer. And he's going to process, or she's going to process, information effortlessly. In the top right-hand corner, you can see we've got a little eyeball there. That's actually my 5.5-year-old daughter's eyeball. She very kindly volunteered for this. And I've asked the computer to simulate her eyeball dilating when she's thinking consciously about a problem. Tim, could we click on page 2? This is a section from Guernsey law. It's the traffic law, 25 mile per hour all-year speed limit, and there's a set of roads that make up a boundary, and there's some roads at the bottom that are excluded. This is natural language. What we're going to do now is we're going to get a computer to analyse this natural language. It's going to write its own program, and then it's going to load the program back into its own memory. And where it's going to sit in the end, it's going to sit in its subconscious memory. But it's going to start off by doing some very conscious, laboured calculations. Tim, if you could go to page 1. Excellent. I'd like you to click on Machine Read Law. Okay, TEDxStPeterPort and it has loaded. I'd like you to click on Identify Features, which is the third button down. Now the computer's going to do some really hard thinking. It's looked at a database of road names and roads. It's put together all these little GPS points. It said, how do I join them together? And it's drawn this blue line to join them up. It's identified that there's actually a roundabout, which is that little blue circle. It's done some very complicated calculations to try and get what we're meaning by this boundary. And at the moment, it's thinking. It said, OK, there's an inner area and there's an outer area to this boundary. Could you just click on page 3 for a moment? Thank you, Tim. This green area is effectively the centre line for some roads, and it's done some more difficult calculations. It's walked around this boundary, and it's pushed it out a little bit and said, do you know what? I think within here is a 25 mile per hour boundary, and that red bit marks an area where I have to be a little bit on my edge because I think the speed limit's changing. But there's also some excluded areas. It says, I think these are the roads you're talking about which are excluded. Now, this is all very well and good, but to implement these things in practice, we can't labour over calculations. They've got to be done instantly, and machines need to be able to talk to the law and do calculations instantaneously from it. If we could just click on page 1. So what we're going to do now, we're going to imagine we're a government, and we're going to test our law. We're going to test it in a virtual world using a pair of virtual 3D glasses. We're not going to see what happens to the law in real life. We're going to test it in a virtual environment. So to do this, and this is traffic law, I'm going to send a virtual car into this boundary, and let's see what happens to it. Could you click on Interact with Object? So we created a thought process. It's sending a car into this zone. It's travelling at 35 miles an hour, and it's now going, I've got to slow down. I'm travelling through town. And then it's going to exit the boundary, and it's going to speed up again. It's gone up the Val de Terres, and now it's going 35 miles an hour. So what we've done here, a machine has read the law, it's created its own program, it's loaded it into its own memory, and now, using telemetry, it can talk to anything in society. So imagine this. Imagine if objects, your phones, your 3D printer can talk to the law. Imagine if someone wanted to print a gun from their 3D printer, but the 3D printer goes, no, you can't do it. I may as well be at a stop sign. I'm not going to let you print this 3D gun. Imagine if there was a peace accord in the Ukraine, and the peace accord was signed, and what if all their munitions just switched off? They said, you know what, we read the law this morning, and we see that a treaty has been signed, so we're going to switch off today. So if machines can react to the law, I think we could have a much better society. And if judges could test their internal logic of their decisions, I think we wouldn't have appeal processes. If we can trade stocks and shares in the stock market in a nanosecond, just imagine a world where judgments and disputes are solved in a microsecond. We could get a whole step change in society. Stephen, what are your thoughts?
Wow. I just want to firstly say we're so excited to demonstrate this today. This is the first time we've done it. It's been a miracle we got it all working on time, but we're just so excited about what we've been able to do with it. What does it mean? Well, let's go back to the 3 points which I alluded to at the start. Imagine if, for accessibility, getting the legal advice that people needed or wanted was just as easy as doing a Google search. We could make it that easy if you could make a program do that. And then think about if we're taking, as Martyn was talking about, an objectives-based approach. So laws don't need to be about long reams of text anymore. They can be computer programs, which can be dynamic. And we can set the objectives. If we can just go back to the slides, please.
Yeah, we're there now.
They can be dynamic. We can set the objectives, what outcomes we want, what aims we want, and the computer can do the rest. Let's take the traffic law as an example. The objectives might be to get from A to B as quickly as possible whilst not having any accidents. The computer could calculate what risks you're able to take on your journey based on your particular circumstances, which may be the school run, for example. And then as Martyn was saying, I'm going to be charging extra now. As Martyn was saying, our world's been surrounded by the Internet of Things, which everything's connected. Wonder if we could create objects which instead of having to be pre-programmed to be compliant with the law, could just read the law. And say, take the self-driving car as an example. It wouldn't have to be programmed to comply with the traffic law. It could just read the highway code. And if the highway code changed at any point, the car would know that. Or if you took it to another country to drive around, it would automatically read what the laws are to drive around in that country without you having to interfere with it at all. It's incredible things which you can do with it, and that's just the start. But ultimately, in a world where technology is changing at an exponential pace, the laws that govern our societies have to be able to change equally as quickly to be able to accommodate those new technologies. And with technologies and approaches such as Lex Plus, you no longer need to think of laws as being these complicated, long reams of text, but instead computer programs, which are dynamic, evolving in real time, and accessible to everyone. We're the Ozoris Project. Thank you for listening, and I just want to say we're really proud to be in Guernsey.